This is the perfect RIA, in case you didn't know. Bringing you all the strategies to help your business grow. Are you happy? Are you satisfied? Are you hanging on the edge of your seat? Sit back and listen in while you feel the beat, yeah. Another myth bites the dust.
Hello, TBR Nation. This is Amber Kuhn from the Perfect REA. Thank you for joining me on today's Follow-Up Friday. On Monday, Matt and Micah were talking about a recent experience that happened while Micah was on vacation and how it translated into how things affect you in your life and what decisions you're making. What they wanted listeners to take from this episode was two angles. One being that there's an illusion that when something bad happens, you'll immediately know what to do. And the other is that people tend to not want to think about things where your head is in the sand and that things can never happen to you. And in some situations, people think that someone else is going to help and know what to do, but those people can also be giving advice that could make things worse. The story that Micah shared was that while his family was in Hawaii on a boat dive, they were wrapping things up, getting everything off the boat. They saw another boat that had waves crashing over it, filling it with water and pushing against the rocks. They started asking the people on the boat if they were okay, but they weren't getting a response. The boat capsized, so Mike and his family started looking for people to see how many were on board, and they were starting to work to tow the boat and bring things to shore. One of the things that he noticed was that there were about 100 people watching, and at one point, someone even commented that they should have reacted and helped sooner. Once this all took place, Mike and his family took the time to debrief on everything that happened, and one of the takeaways was that you have to be your own first responder and be ready for emergencies. It's easy to be in denial about things until the split second before something becomes an emergency. And then you have to step up and do something. Where this will happen in your practice is with an employee and assuming that someone will never leave. Instead, you need to assume that they'll leave without notice and take your clients. So think about that through, not in a situation that it could never happen. But if that scenario happens, whether you see it coming or not, what is your plan of response? The guy said that you need to find a balance between this, from what's the reality of something that could happen and what's the likelihood. That way you're not putting your sole focus on these possibilities. You need to know that they exist and think through them, but not dwell on them. Some examples of looking at these situations in your practice are with your custodian. Micah shared that he has a backup custodian in case anything were to ever happen with his current one. Now, he has faith and confidence in the one that he's using, but he does have a plan in the event something were to happen. Some other things to consider are, what if you lose your top 5 clients? And what happens to your practice then? What about prospecting? There are areas within your practice that you need to be aware of. Look at those weaknesses and have a plan ready if something were to happen. These plans don't need to be anything crazy. You can just start a one-pager for a situation, such as what happens if you're off the grid and the SEC arrives, and make sure that you review that with your team before you leave. In Matt's case, the first step for the team to do is to call Micah. And they pointed out that this is the first step, even if Matt is in the office, because by reaching out to someone on the outside, you can lean on them to get their opinion. And this needs to be someone who doesn't have skin in the game. The guys also shared some tips for preparedness that impact both your practice and your family. They said, make sure that you and your kids know first aid and wilderness survival skills and travel with a medical kit. Make sure that you have smoke detectors and fire extinguishers and that your family knows where they are and how to use them. Keep a winter kit in your vehicle. This especially applies to Micah with living in Alaska. They also recommended watching fail videos for car accidents. Matt does this with his daughters where they'll pause the video to discuss what happened, what went wrong, and what could have been done to prevent that. On the practice side, he'll do something similar to educate himself on when people get sanctioned by the SEC and what were the warning signs that people ignored. Also, think about how are you bringing someone in to look at your blind spots, things that maybe you just aren't paying attention to. Let's get into action items. Do emergency drills. Pick 2 or 3 things to do with your family, yourself, and with your practice, and make sure you have a disaster recovery plan. You need to have a contingency plan in place. This is required for RAAs, and it's a best practice for all firms. And these need to be written plans that if something happens to you, what will happen to your practice? Know the what ifs and your plans for them, and make sure that your team and your clients know as well. On Thursday, Jamie went a little deeper into that situation with the boat that Micah shared with Matt on Monday, and how many people are so often ready to give you advice on subjects that they have little to no knowledge of, and how they don't actually help. And this led into talking about disaster recovery. With the story about the boat capsizing, Jamie said as this is happening and they were witnessing it, they didn't want to rush into saving immediately because it can put everyone else in danger, and that the first responsibility was to confirm how many people were on board. Once the boat started going underwater, Jamie and Micah kept confirming the number of people that they were seeing and started asking them simple questions. But even though they were loudly trying to communicate, they weren't being responded to. Jamie said the men on the boat were in a fight or flight situation. They had so much fear that they weren't able to respond or verbalize what was happening. Once they had done what they could do, Jamie and her family went through a checklist to make sure everyone had all their gear, and they did an after action where they went through the situation, what went wrong, what happened, and why did it happen. The first thing they commented on was that the men should have left the boat immediately. It was just too dangerous once the boat started taking on water. The other thing they discussed was the critique they received from the people on the shoreline and what other option they had. But they had to assess the situation and what was about to happen. If they had done anything else, it would have put them at risk. There was also a question as to whether they should throw life preservers in the water, and while they eventually did, they realized that they should have been thrown in immediately. They also discussed that there were a lot of people telling them what should have happened. They weren't there from the get-go to see the entire situation, but they were telling them with a sense of authority what happened. Jamie said their details just weren't accurate. The point of the story was to illustrate how many times people show up to give advice, but they have no real experience in it. So when you're approaching a situation, understanding responses and how you're going to react helps you to be better prepared for things. With this, and even though the story Jamie shared was a dramatic circumstance, she said to consider your company meetings and how many times something happens where you start pulling people in who shouldn't be involved. Another point is related to giving direct orders. When a situation arises, think about the nouns you've been using. Instead, you need to use specific people. They need to be called out to do specific things. If you hide behind the anonymity of saying they, us, we, etc., then it's no one. By using the person's name, it's critical to know who's responsible for a task and who's expected to get something done. And when it comes to advice, remember, if you're not a stakeholder, you need to listen and let people vent. But you don't need to offer an opinion because you're only seeing a glimpse of what's happening. So if you're a business owner, make sure that when you're sharing frustrations with others and they're giving advice, consider whether that's the advice you should be listening to. Also, related to the situation Jamie shared was having this after action, a debrief of what everyone saw and what was missed. Immediately after something happens, you have the most knowledge of a situation. So anytime there's a webinar, surge, critical system update, or compliance issue in their office, they do an after action to go through what action did they take, what was the goal, and what was the response time. Jamie said this is important to do, especially when it comes to a disaster recovery plan. This isn't just catastrophic things. It could be losing internet for 24 hours or cell towers going down. They have their policies and procedures for what needs to take place if this happens, and they do drills on this too. So the big question Jamie asked is how many of you have done a disaster recovery situation in your office where you take the policies for how you're supposed to run your business and are making sure your team is equipped to know what they need to do when the time comes, because you'll also learn all the things you couldn't do or that didn't work. Let's get into action items. What's your family protocol for an emergency? Do you know what your next point of action is in a disaster? What's the communication policy? And make sure that everyone knows this. Make sure that you have disaster recovery for your office and be critical of people who just show up with advice. Before we go, TPR Nation, if you're ready to grow and dramatically impact your life and those around you and you want resources to help, reach out to us at lifestyle@theperfectre.com or you can visit theperfectre.com/grow. That wraps up this week's recap. Thank you for joining me, and please share this or any of our episodes with another advisor or team member who you think might benefit from listening. And be sure to subscribe to the Perfect RIA podcast so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, happy planning.
Hold on before we go. Something that you need to know. This isn't tax, legal, or investment advice. That isn't our intent. Information designed to change lives. Financial planning can make you thrive. Start today, don't think twice. Be a better husband, father, mother, and wife. The perfect RIA, the perfect